Ronald Reagan, the 40th president of the United States who could bomb a country, forget why, crack a joke, and still get a standing ovation. He sold weapons to enemies, ignored a plague, armed future terrorists, crashed the economy, and smiled the whole damn time. He made war look cinematic, poverty look deserved, and corruption look presidential. You've heard the myth, now meet the madness. This is everything wrong with Ronald Reagan. Sorry to interrupt, but if Ronald Reagan would still be alive, he would have subscribed to this channel. Why won't you? Thanks. From B-list to ballot. Here is a question. How does a guy who shared screen time with a chimpanzee end up holding the nuclear codes? Ronald Reagan was born in a small Illinois town in 1911 and somehow climbed from radio announcer to Hollywood's least memorable leading man. His filmography reads like a discount bin at a Blockbuster going out of business, Bedtime for Bonzo, That Hagen Girl, and other cinematic treasures nobody's watching on TCM. And yet, after being governor of California and slashing mental health services like he was pruning a hedge, America looked at this guy and said, yes, this is our man. Was it the good hair, the voice, or the fact he could memorize lines and pretend to feel things? Either way, he fumbled his way from B-movie dad to leader of the free world with the charisma of your uncle who quotes John Wayne at Thanksgiving. And just like that, the country handed the keys to the White House to someone whose resume included a chimpanzee co-star, the comedian-in-chief. Ronald Reagan was a one-man sitcom if the show was about nuclear annihilation, economic collapse, and a guy forgetting he caused both. But hey, he had timing. After getting shot in 1981, he looked at his surgeons and quipped, "Please tell me you're Republicans." That's either courage under fire or stand-up delusion with internal bleeding. He once said, "Politics is supposed to be the second oldest profession. I have come to realize that it bears a very close resemblance to the first." See what he did there? Reagan was hilarious, if your sense of humor was forged in the Catskills in 1934. He also joked during a hot mic moment, "My fellow Americans, I'm pleased to tell you today that I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes. Nuclear war, but make it a punchline." That's Reagan, cracking jokes while the national debt skyrockets and entire continents hold their breath. America got a comic-in-chief. Unfortunately, the laugh track was the sound of history face-palming. Weapons for hostages. In the grand tradition of do as I say, not as I secretly fund, Reagan's crew pulled off one of the most spectacularly shady operations in US history, the Iran-Contra affair. Here's how it went down. Despite loudly preaching that the US doesn't negotiate with terrorists, Reagan's administration sold weapons to Iran. Yes, that Iran, while they were under an arms embargo. Then, because why not double down, they funneled the profits to the Contras in Nicaragua. A right-wing rebel group Congress specifically said, hey, don't fund these guys. So naturally, the Reagan team did it anyway, behind everyone's back, and lied about it. When the whole thing blew up, Reagan pulled off the political version of I don't recall, over and over. And America kind of shrugged and moved on because, well, Grandpa said he didn't mean it. But make no mistake, this wasn't just a whoopsie-daisy. It was a full-blown constitutional crisis that should have ended careers. Instead, it just gave Oliver North a talk show. Reagan broke the law, lied to the country, and still rode off into the sunset like a cowboy hero. That's not leadership, it's performance art. AIDS? Never heard of her. By 1987, over 20,000 Americans had died from AIDS. Do you know how many times Reagan mentioned it publicly before then? Exactly once. The epidemic began in 1981, the same year he took office. But instead of empathy or action, his administration turned a deadly virus into a punchline. Reporters asked about it in press briefings and were met with smirks and laughter. Literally. Reagan's press secretary joked about dying gay men while the White House shrugged. Meanwhile, the LGBTQ+ community screamed for help, only to be told they didn't matter. Reagan's silence wasn't just negligence, it was lethal indifference. Imagine leading a country where a mysterious, incurable disease is killing thousands, and you think, nah, let's talk about Star Wars and tax cuts instead. It wasn't until Rock Hudson, Reagan's personal friend and a Hollywood actor, died that he even began to care. Translation: Reagan only noticed AIDS when it hit close to home. Until then, the official response was silence, followed by more silence, and then a nice round of victim blaming. Bravo! Mental health? Not my problem. Before he was president, Reagan served as governor of California, where he pioneered the art of pretending homelessness is a personal choice. He slashed state funding for psychiatric hospitals, dumping thousands of mentally ill people onto the streets. Then, in a bold sequel nobody asked for, he brought that same policy to the national stage as president. In 1981, he gutted federal mental health programs, closed community centers, and left entire populations with nowhere to go but shelters, jail cells, or the sidewalk. The result? A nationwide surge in homelessness, mental illness in the open, and a broken system we still haven't fixed. Reagan talked a lot about freedom, but apparently that included the freedom to suffer untreated psychosis on a park bench. The man literally emptied hospitals and handed people bus tickets. And to this day, the US mental health crisis still carries his fingerprints. 160 billion oops. The savings and loan crisis was a slow-motion economic car crash, caused by Reagan's love affair with deregulation and his belief that banks could totally be trusted to police themselves. Spoiler alert, they couldn't. After removing safeguards from the S&L industry, hundreds of institutions went full YOLO with risky investments, shady accounting, and flat-out fraud. When it all imploded, 747 savings and loans collapsed like a Jenga tower built on a fault line. And who picked up the tab? Oh yeah, us. Taxpayers got stuck with a $160 billion bailout, and that's 1980s money. Reagan's response: silence, denial, and the same tired line about how government is the problem. This wasn't just bad policy, it was a blueprint for future disasters like the 2008 crash. He turned Wall Street into a casino, handed the dealers a blank check, and then blamed the roulette wheel when everything exploded. The lesson? When you let financial crooks run wild and deregulate like there's no tomorrow, tomorrow gets expensive fast. Hookups and deals. The Department of Housing and Urban Development under Reagan wasn't so much a federal agency as it was a money fountain for well-connected cronies. Here's the scam. HUD grants and contracts, meant to support low-income housing, were quietly funneled to political donors and insiders through a beautiful system of bid rigging, favoritism, and wink-nudge deals. It got so bad, 16 officials and contractors were convicted of corruption-related crimes. And this wasn't small potatoes. Billions in housing funds were misused while actual Americans were living in slums or on the streets. Reagan himself tried to stay above the fray, but it was his people, his appointees, and his deregulate everything philosophy that turned HUD into a swampy ATM machine. The whole thing reeked of Reaganomics in action. Reward the rich, forget the rest, and call it patriotism. Meanwhile, real public housing projects were left to rot, and so were the people in them. But hey, at least his donors got nicer vacation homes. Toxic politics. Welcome to Sewergate, where toxic waste became political gold. Reagan's Environmental Protection Agency, under the leadership of Administrator Rita Lavelle, didn't just neglect the environment. They hijacked the Superfund program, meant to clean up hazardous waste sites, and rerouted it to help Republican campaigns. Instead of scrubbing pollution, they scrubbed grant allocations until the right GOP donors were smiling. Lavelle herself was convicted of perjury because apparently lying under oath is easier than cleaning up actual toxic sludge. And Reagan? He responded with the moral clarity of a shrug emoji, replacing Lavelle only when the scandal got too gross to ignore, both chemically and politically. The kicker: this wasn't just bureaucratic bumbling, it was systemic corruption involving the literal poisoning of American communities. Kids were playing on contaminated sites so rich guys could get reelected. Reagan's EPA didn't just fail to protect the environment, it turned pollution into a partisan asset. So yeah, the trees were fine, Ron. It was your team that stank. Bribery for beginners. The WedTech scandal was a masterclass in government corruption starring, you guessed it, Reagan-era cronies. WedTech was a shady little defense contractor in the Bronx that claimed to be minority-owned to qualify for no-bid government contracts. Reagan's administration handed it lucrative deals, bypassing competition like it was handing out raffle tickets at a donor dinner. And then came the bribes. Loads of them. Bribes to officials, lobbyists, and even Reagan's appointments. Multiple top-tier staffers were caught up in the mess, including people in the Justice Department. You know, the place that's supposed to stop crimes. The entire scheme was wrapped in a bow of, "We totally didn't know this was illegal," which is Reagan-era speak for, "We hoped no one would notice." If WedTech made missiles as efficiently as it made bribes, we'd have colonized Mars by now. But nope, just another scandal the Gipper tried to laugh off while the nation picked up the ethical rubble. Stealing the playbook. Let's talk about DebateGate, the time Reagan's 1980 campaign allegedly got its hands on Jimmy Carter's confidential debate prep materials. That's right, before he even got to the White House, Reagan's team may have cheated to get there. The stolen documents included strategy notes, anticipated questions, and policy summaries. Basically, the political equivalent of having your opponent's diary before a boxing match. When it came out in 1983, the Reagan White House claimed ignorance, did its patented "I don't recall" shuffle, and refused to investigate thoroughly. Because nothing says innocence like immediately slamming the door on accountability. Congress asked questions, the media sniffed around, and Reagan kept smiling, waving, and acting like it was no big deal. But it was. This was a breach of political ethics that made Watergate look like a bad prank. Reagan was charming and calm during that debate, sure. Helps when you already know the other guy's lines. If anyone else did this, they'd be disqualified. Reagan? He got inaugurated. Welcome to American politics, brought to you by the Cheat Sheet Commander-in-Chief. You're fired, all of you. Who needs unions when you can just wipe out the whole workforce with one memo? Well, in 1981, 12,000 air traffic controllers went on strike, asking for things like better hours, safer equipment, and not crashing planes. Reagan's response? Fire them all. Not some of them, all of them. It was the largest mass firing of federal employees in U.S. history, and it wasn't just about punishing strikers. It was a calculated hit on organized labor nationwide. Reagan banned them from ever working for the federal government again. It sent a chilling message to unions everywhere. Organize and you'll be obliterated. The business world took notes. Union busting became trendy. Worker protections eroded. And today's gig economy? You can thank Papa Reagan for that slippery slope. Patco's strike was a tipping point, and Reagan gleefully turned the tip into a shove off the cliff. The irony? He had once led a union himself. SAG, no less. But hey, different rules when you go from Hollywood to Washington. He may have smiled like your grandpa, but he wielded union-busting policies like a guillotine. All while planes flew under the control of barely trained replacements. Deficit daddy. Reagan's economic plan was like a diet that skips food and triples dessert. First, he gave massive tax cuts to the wealthy and corporations. Then he went on the most expensive military shopping spree since World War II. Result? The national debt didn't just rise, it tripled in 8 years. Reagan inherited a debt of about $900 billion. Supposedly, the wealth would rain down from the yachts to the people paddling in economic misery. Instead, middle-class wages stagnated, social programs got slashed, and billionaires popped champagne. Reagan said, "Government is the problem," and then ran up the largest tab in its history. The only thing trickling down was debt interest. His budget directors resigned in protest. His own economists warned him, and he still just smiled and blamed everyone else. The man managed to turn fiscal conservatism into a punchline. If this was a business, he'd be fired and sued. But since it was America, we gave him a parade. The welfare queen lied. In a speech in 1976, Reagan introduced America to the welfare queen, a woman in Chicago who allegedly used 80 fake names to collect benefits. The story was wildly exaggerated, laced with inaccuracies, and laced even harder with racial innuendo. And Reagan ran with it. Again, and again, and again. The image of a Cadillac-driving, luxury-loving welfare abuser became central to his campaign to slash welfare programs. The Queen wasn't representative of welfare recipients, but that didn't matter. Reagan used her as a political mascot, wrapping budget cuts in moral panic and dog whistling so loud it broke windows. Forget facts. Reagan had vibes. And those vibes told voters that poor black women were stealing their tax dollars. Never mind that corporate subsidies, tax loopholes, and military bloat dwarfed welfare spending. Reagan created a villain, told a bedtime story for boomers, and gutted support for America's most vulnerable. All in the name of fiscal responsibility. Bravo! Grenada? Really? In 1983, Reagan woke up and chose Grenada, a Caribbean island the size of Detroit. The U.S. launched a full-scale invasion to rescue a handful of American medical students and allegedly stop a Marxist coup. But let's be real, it was a flex. Congress didn't approve it. Our allies weren't consulted. The United Nations condemned it. Even Margaret Thatcher was mad, and when you've annoyed the Iron Lady, you've really outdone yourself. Reagan called it a victory for freedom. Critics called it a publicity stunt wrapped in a beach vacation. The U.S. military dropped bombs on a nation whose defense strategy was hope they don't show up. But hey, it was great optics for a president drowning in scandals. Media loved the footage. Reagan's poll numbers soared. If Vietnam was a tragedy, Grenada was a farce, with real bullets. Blow for democracy? While Reagan was busy selling the Just Say No campaign to school children, his beloved Nicaraguan Contras were allegedly saying yes please to Colombian coke. Multiple investigations, journalistic and congressional, linked U.S.-backed rebels to massive drug operations flooding American cities. And the CIA? They seem more concerned with plausible deniability than actual denial. Reagan publicly denied everything, of course. Meanwhile, planes full of weapons flew south, and planes full of cocaine flew north. The profits funded more weapons. It was a perfect circle of hypocrisy. Preach morality at home, fund narco-militias abroad. The war on drugs and the war on communism collided, and guess who got hit? Inner-city neighborhoods in America. Reagan didn't just look the other way, his administration built the road and lit the runway. History hasn't forgotten. The US government was helping drug traffickers while locking up black teens for possession. But yeah, Nancy said no, so everything's cool. Borked beyond belief. In 1987, Reagan nominated Robert Bork to the Supreme Court, a man whose idea of progress was rolling back civil rights and privacy protections to the Stone Age. Bork opposed the Civil Rights Act. He hated Roe v. Wade. He thought the Constitution didn't protect a right to privacy. In other words, he was like if the Federalist Papers got drunk and started ranting on Twitter. But this time, Congress had a backbone. The Senate said no, loudly and publicly, in one of the most brutal confirmation rejections in modern history. Reagan tried to play it cool, but make no mistake, this was a giant L on his record. The backlash was fierce. Civil rights leaders rallied, women's groups mobilized, and Bork himself became a verb. To get borked now means to be publicly, thoroughly, and gloriously rejected. Reagan's attempt to cement a right-wing legacy backfired so hard, it created its own vocabulary. Maybe next time, don't nominate a guy who thinks Brown v. Board was a clerical error. Houston, we have a problem. The 1986 Challenger disaster wasn't just a tragedy, it was preventable. Engineers begged NASA not to launch. The O-ring seals were faulty in cold weather, and the forecast was cold. But political pressure to hit deadlines overruled basic safety. And Reagan? He was all about optics. A teacher was on board. The press was watching. Postponement was bad PR. So the shuttle launched, and 73 seconds later, it disintegrated. 7 astronauts died, including Krista McAuliffe, the first civilian in space. The White House quickly launched its favorite strategy: deny, distract, defer. Reagan gave a moving speech, sure, but the investigation revealed systemic negligence fueled by budget cuts and bureaucratic arrogance on his watch. NASA wasn't just underfunded, it was pushed to deliver success at the expense of safety. Challenger wasn't a freak accident, it was a political ticking time bomb. And when it exploded, Reagan floated above the wreckage on a cloud of nice words while avoiding blame like a pro. Watt in the world? Meet James Watt, Reagan's first Secretary of the Interior and perhaps the most anti-environmental environmentalist in U.S. history. His job was to protect public lands. Instead, he tried to sell them. Literally. Watt opened millions of acres to mining, drilling, and logging, declaring that preserving nature was less important than making profits. He once said protecting the environment for future generations didn't matter because, quote, "I do not know how many future generations we can count on before the Lord returns." Translation: Jesus is coming, so drill, baby, drill. He offended nearly everyone, not just tree huggers, but also racial minorities, disabled people, and women, in one speech. He eventually resigned under pressure, but not before setting the environmental movement back decades. Oh, and after leaving office, he was indicted on 24 felony counts for influence peddling. Reagan picked him, defended him, and let him run wild. Because nothing says stewardship like turning the planet into a strip mine before the rapture. Social Security? Surprise tax. Ah yes, the president who rode into office waving a flag of tax cuts, then turned around and whacked Social Security like a piñata at a deficit party. In 1983, Reagan raised Social Security taxes as part of a bipartisan reform, which sounds noble until you realize who took the hit: working people and retirees. Classic Reaganomics. He told America that this would save the program, while stuffing the surplus into the general budget to offset the hole he'd blasted into the economy with tax cuts for millionaires and Cold War cosplay spending. Imagine a guy stealing from your piggy bank to pay for his Ferrari, then patting himself on the back for balancing the books. That's Reagan. And to this day, Social Security's trust fund is still a political punching bag, because Reagan made it acceptable to fix retirement by charging you more while billionaires contribute relatively nothing. But hey, trickle down, right? Bombs and blunders. In 1983, a suicide bomber drove a truck packed with explosives into a U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 American service members. It remains one of the deadliest single attacks on U.S. forces overseas. And here's the worst part: everyone saw it coming. There were multiple warnings. Security protocols were laughably inadequate. Troops were even ordered to keep their weapons unloaded. Because nothing says force protection like, "Don't be ready for an attack." Reagan's administration treated the mission like a PR prop, sending troops into a civil war zone without a clear plan, then acting shocked when it all went horribly wrong. The president gave a solemn speech, offered thoughts and prayers, and then pulled out. Not before, not after a policy review, right after the bloodbath. It was a mission with no objective, no backup, and no accountability. But don't worry, Reagan still found time to invade Grenada a few days later so he could look tough. Beirut was a warning sign, and Reagan hit the gas anyway. Lasers in space. Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, sounded like something scribbled in a 12-year-old's notebook next to a sketch of a TIE fighter. The idea? Build a massive space-based laser defense system to shoot down incoming Soviet nukes. It was pitched as a high-tech shield to make nuclear war obsolete. Translation: Let's spend billions on a concept that defies both physics and common sense. Scientists laughed. The Pentagon winced. The Soviets thought we'd lost our minds, and maybe we had. SDI was so unworkable, it never even reached prototype status. It didn't stop missiles. It didn't stop the Cold War. But it did stop common sense from entering the Oval Office. Reagan talked about it like it was a done deal. Meanwhile, actual experts pointed out it would take decades, if not centuries, to make functional. He even refused to give it up during arms negotiations, making it a deal breaker in nuclear disarmament talks. SDI didn't save us from annihilation. It just padded defense contractor wallets and made America look like it was building a Death Star. Procurement for prison time. Meet Melvin Paisley, Reagan's Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Procurement, and a man so corrupt he made lobbyists blush. His job was to approve military contracts. What he actually did was take bribes from defense contractors in exchange for lucrative deals. Want to sell overpriced junk to the Pentagon? Slide Mr. Paisley a check under the table. It was like pay-to-play meets Battleship. He even helped steer contracts before he officially had the job. Efficiency. After leaving office, he was convicted of multiple felonies and sentenced to 4 years in prison. And Reagan, silent as usual, because in the Reagan era, the only thing trickling down was corruption. Paisley's legacy is a reminder that small government under Reagan just meant fewer rules for the crooks in charge. Mises more. Edwin Meese was Reagan's close friend, legal advisor, and eventually Attorney General, a man who was basically a walking ethics violation in a bad suit. He was involved in so many shady dealings that journalists lost track. There was the Bechtel pipeline scandal, the WedTech scandal, the Iran-Contra whispers, a pattern of I didn't know and I just happened to benefit. Even the Reagan administration, yes, the one that made corruption look casual, finally had enough. Meese resigned in 1988, not because he was convicted, he wasn't, but because the stench of impropriety was so thick it clouded the Constitution. His resignation letter might as well have read, "Oops." Reagan defended him until the bitter end, calling him a man of unwavering integrity. Ollie's Shredder Show. When the Iran-Contra scandal needed a fall guy, up stepped Marine Lieutenant Column Oliver North, decorated officer, patriotic poseur, and compulsive document shredder. North wasn't just involved in the arms for hostages deal, he ran it. He coordinated sales, diverted money to the Contras, and lied about it to Congress like it was karaoke night. But when caught, he didn't flinch. He gave a performance so dramatic, he practically earned an Emmy. Dressed in uniform, flag pin gleaming, he told America he was just following orders. Because nothing says constitutional patriotism like blaming your crimes on your boss. He admitted to destroying evidence, misusing funds, and violating the law, but somehow came out looking like a hero to half the country. Reagan, for his part, claimed he had no idea what was going on. Sure, just another rogue colonel running a multi-million-dollar illegal international operation from inside the White House. Together, they turned scandal into spectacle, and justice, that got shredded too. Joking while bleeding. After surviving an assassination attempt in 1981, Reagan looked up from the operating table and said, "Please tell me you're Republicans." America swooned, late-night hosts melted. Boomers got misty-eyed. But let's be honest, if any other president did this, we'd be like, "Dude, are you okay?" Some saw it as cool under pressure. Others saw it as a weird partisan quip to the guys literally trying to save his life. But that was Reagan. Always on brand, always auditioning. Even while bleeding internally, the man had to deliver a punchline. His whole presidency was like this. A big budget performance complete with zingers, dramatic pauses, and carefully staged optics. This moment is still held up as peak Reagan, which really says something about how low the bar was set. Survive an assassination attempt? Historic. Turn it into a sitcom? Pure Reagan. Star charts and statecraft. You'd think nuclear codes and planetary alignments wouldn't mix, but under the Reagans, they did. After the 1981 shooting, Nancy Reagan turned to celebrity astrologer Joan Quigley to help protect Ronnie. She didn't just ask about Mercury retrograde, she let astrology dictate Reagan's official schedule, and the White House went along with it. Imagine if JFK delayed the Cuban Missile Crisis because Venus was in Scorpio. That's where we were. Secret Service agents reportedly had to double-check with an astrologer before scheduling events. Meanwhile, the Cold War was heating up, the debt was ballooning, and Nancy was clutching a crystal ball behind closed doors. And Reagan? He let it happen, like the world's most powerful puppet on an invisible zodiac string. So much for the age of reason. This was the age of Aquarius with nukes. A blind eye to Black America. Throughout his presidency, Reagan refused to meet with major Black civil rights leaders, even Coretta Scott King. That's right, the widow of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. couldn't get a sit-down with Mr. Morning in America. Instead, Reagan slashed programs that helped the poor, vetoed sanctions against apartheid South Africa, and fought tooth and nail against making MLK Day a national holiday. Reagan's policies gutted housing, education, and welfare programs that disproportionately supported Black communities, then turned around and acted confused when poverty worsened. He loved to talk about the shining city on a hill. He just made sure to turn off the lights in certain neighborhoods. This wasn't just neglect, it was strategic erasure. Honoring SS soldiers by mistake. In 1985, Reagan visited a German military cemetery in Bitburg that just happened to include graves of Waffen-SS members. You know, actual Nazis. And just to twist the knife, he skipped a visit to a Jewish concentration camp beforehand. PR? Nightmare? Absolutely. Holocaust survivors and global leaders were appalled. Even his buddy Helmut Kohl looked uncomfortable. But Reagan pushed forward, laying the wreath anyway, smiling for the cameras, and pretending it was totally normal to pay respects next to mass murderers. His moral compass that day? Spinning like a fidget spinner in a hurricane. Bitburg wasn't a diplomatic misstep, it was a tone-deaf PR disaster that showed just how far Reagan would go to score Cold War brownie points with Germany. The October question. According to multiple credible reports and investigations, Reagan's 1980 campaign may have negotiated with Iran to delay the release of American hostages until after the election, denying President Carter an October surprise. Hostages were miraculously freed literally minutes after Reagan was sworn in. Coincidence? Maybe. But insiders, including former Iranian officials, claimed Reagan's people struck a deal behind the scenes. If true, that's not just dirty politics, it's treason. And if false, it's still suspicious as hell. But since Reagan always played the role of the innocent grandfather, the media largely moved on. Meanwhile, Carter was left holding the diplomatic bag, and Reagan got to strut onto the world stage like he saved the day. Memory? Never heard of it. In his post-presidency years, Ronald Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But many insiders, and even a few doctors, suggested he may have shown early signs while in office. Repeated verbal flubs, confusion during interviews, and awkward pauses became increasingly common. He once told reporters he hadn't been briefed on major issues he'd already spoken about. During Iran-Contra testimony, he said, "I don't recall so often it could have been his ringtone." And the White House? They circled the wagons and did what they always did. Denied, distracted, and kept the teleprompter rolling. If Reagan was slipping mentally during his presidency, it raises serious questions about who was really calling the shots. If he wasn't, well then he was just that bad at remembering felonies. Either way, Morning in America came with a lot of fog. Founding Fathers, fake edition. Ronald Reagan loved quoting the Founding Fathers. He just didn't let accuracy get in the way. He frequently dropped lines like, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction," attributing them to Jefferson, Washington, or whoever sounded most impressive that day. Problem is, many of those quotes were either misattributed, completely fabricated, or cherry-picked out of context. But that didn't stop Reagan from building entire speeches and policies on them. Want to bash big government? Pretend Madison predicted welfare. He turned the Constitution into a stage prop and the founders into his own personal hype squad. And Americans ate it up because nothing says patriotic like a quote that feels true, even if it's not. Reagan didn't just rewrite history, he ghostwrote the Enlightenment. Planet? What planet? The 1980s weren't just about perms and synth pop, they were also when scientists began shouting about climate change. Reagan's response? Slash the budget. Gut the Environmental Protection Agency, cancel renewable energy programs. His administration treated environmental science like a bad horoscope. Solar energy? Too expensive. Emission standards? Too much red tape. Acid rain? Sounds like a band name. In 1981, he even tried to eliminate the Department of Energy's Renewable Energy Division entirely. Meanwhile, the Earth was heating up, the ozone was thinning, and Reagan was asleep at the wheel. He helped bury climate policy under decades of denial and delay. By the time future presidents started paying attention, we were already playing catch-up. Reagan didn't just ignore climate change. He set the blueprint for doing nothing while the planet burned. Cool legacy, Ron. The Saddam bromance. During the 1980s, while Saddam Hussein was busy invading Iran and gassing civilians, the Reagan administration decided, hey, let's help this guy out. The US provided satellite intelligence, helicopters, and yes, even materials that could be used for chemical weapons. All because Saddam wasn't the Soviets. That's it. He was our monster until he wasn't. Reagan's team knew about the atrocities. They knew about the gas attacks. And they still doubled down. In 1983, they even sent Donald Rumsfeld to shake Saddam's hand, an image that aged like milk. Later, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and Saddam became public enemy number one, Americans asked, how did this happen? Answer, Reagan happened. He helped create the dictator we'd later spend trillions trying to defeat. But hey, at least he didn't mispronounce nuclear. Apartheid? Not my problem. While Nelson Mandela sat in prison, Reagan's administration was busy cozying up to the white minority regime that jailed him. Why? Because anti-communism, obviously. Sanctions against apartheid South Africa? Reagan vetoed them. Boycotts? Too extreme. Human rights? Let's not get political. He even put Mandela's ANC on the US terrorist watch list, a status that remained until 2008. While much of the world stood in solidarity with South Africa's black majority, Reagan hugged it out with Pretoria and called it diplomacy. Even Congress thought he was being too soft. Imagine being less progressive than 1980s Congress. That's Reagan. He didn't just ignore injustice, he took it out for drinks and gave it foreign aid. Weapons for the wrong guys. To fight the Soviets in Afghanistan, Reagan armed the Mujahideen, rugged warriors who looked great on Time magazine covers. But among those fighters were the future founders of Al-Qaeda. That's right, we trained, equipped, and funded the same extremists who'd eventually bring us 9/11. Reagan called them freedom fighters. Meanwhile, they were busy blowing up Soviet convoys and dreaming of global jihad. Decades of blowback, global terror networks, and the Taliban calling dibs on our weapons caches. Reagan didn't just fight the Cold War, he accidentally helped warm up the next one. But hey, in the 80s, if you hated communism, you gotta check. And a rocket launcher. Nature's greatest threat, trees? In one of his most Reaganist moments ever, the president said, "Trees cause more pollution than automobiles." Yes, he really said that in 1981, on the record, with a straight face. His claim was based on a wildly misunderstood study about natural hydrocarbon emissions. Basically, trees breathe, but not in a way that ruins the atmosphere. Suddenly, America had a president who thought your neighborhood maple was smogging up the place worse than a Ford Pinto. Environmentalists facepalmed, scientists cried, and school children everywhere learned that sometimes presidents say really, really dumb things. It wasn't just a gaffe. It was the symbolic cherry on top of Reagan's war against the environment. trees, the leafy green things that clean our air, that's who he blamed. Honestly, at that point, we're just lucky he didn't start a logging campaign titled Freedom Axes. Wombs before women. In 1982, Reagan's administration rolled out the Fetal Protection Policy, a corporate-friendly gem that allowed companies to ban women from jobs that might pose a risk to a hypothetical fetus. Not an actual fetus, just the possibility of one. Women of childbearing age were barred from working in industries with chemical exposure risks, regardless of whether they were pregnant, planning to be, or had even met a man. Men doing the exact same jobs with the exact same exposures. Totally fine. Apparently, male sperm weren't important enough to worry about. The policy effectively told women, you can either have a uterus or a paycheck. Pick one. The Supreme Court eventually struck it down in 1991, but during Reagan's reign, it was perfectly acceptable to sideline women in the name of protecting unborn children who didn't exist. It's like workplace safety, but with a uterus-shaped loophole. Thanks, Ron. It's integrity and genocide. While indigenous Mayan communities were being massacred in Guatemala by military death squads in the 1980s, Reagan stood firmly on the wrong side of history. He praised General Efrain Rios Montt, an actual dictator leading an actual genocide, as a man of great personal integrity and totally dedicated to democracy. That democracy apparently included scorched earth campaigns, mass executions, and village burnings. Over 200,000 people were killed during Guatemala's civil war, many during Montt's rule. But hey, Montt was anti-communist, so in Reagan's book, he was A-OK. The US sent money, weapons, and warm handshakes, while human rights observers screamed into the void. Supporting genocide? Just another Tuesday in Cold War chess. Fairness is overrated. In 1987, Reagan's FCC repealed the Fairness Doctrine, a policy that had required broadcasters to present opposing viewpoints on controversial issues. In other words, it encouraged balance. Reagan looked at that and said, gross. With it gone, radio and TV stations were free to become ideological fire hoses. And boy did they. This decision laid the groundwork for the rise of hyper-partisan media empires like Fox News and talk radio blowhards who treat conspiracy theories like bedtime stories. The Fairness Doctrine wasn't perfect, but it at least tried to keep things from turning into a national shouting match. Thanks, Ron, for giving America its very first legal license to never hear the other side again. Prayer for ratings. Reagan loved mixing religion and politics like it was his favorite cocktail. Heavy on the holy, light on the facts. One of his most public pushes? A constitutional amendment to allow school prayer. Because clearly, America's biggest crisis in the 1980s was insufficient classroom kneeling. Minor detail. Reagan didn't want students learning critical thinking. He wanted them reciting psalms between algebra and dodgeball. He positioned himself as a moral crusader, even as his administration racked up scandals like unpaid parking tickets. For Reagan, school prayer wasn't about faith. It was about votes. Because nothing says small government like trying to dictate how kids talk to God between spelling tests. Friend until exposed. Before Panama's Manuel Noriega was public enemy number one, he was on Ronald Reagan's Christmas card list. The US funneled cash and intel to Noriega throughout the 80s, despite knowing he was deeply corrupt and, wait for it, a drug trafficker. But hey, he was anti-communist, so who cares if he was smuggling cocaine, silencing dissent, and rigging elections? He was our monster, until he wasn't. Once Noriega's crimes got too big to hide, Reagan's team did the political version of ghosting. Eventually, Bush Sr. cleaned up the mess by invading Panama. But by then, the damage was done. Reagan's policy of support now, regret later, turned the US into a dictator vending machine. Noriega was just one of many, but he's the one who proved, if you embarrass Reagan, you get thrown under the tank. Let cities rot. While white flight suburbs got tax breaks and country clubs, cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Baltimore were left to decay under Reaganomics. Federal investment in urban development slashed, public housing cut, transit infrastructure withered. He labeled poor urban communities as welfare drains while simultaneously gutting the very programs meant to help them recover. The result was an explosion in homelessness, crumbling buildings, and a generation of inner-city kids left behind. And don't expect compassion. Reagan's administration literally tried to redefine ketchup as a vegetable for school lunch programs. The cities didn't fail. They were left to rot by a president who preferred trickle-down fairy tales over asphalt reality. Donovan's dirty departure. Raymond Donovan, Reagan's first Secretary of Labor, was supposed to be the champion of America's workers. Instead, he spent more time in court than in cabinet meetings. Accused of fraud, larceny, and ties to the mob, Donovan resigned in 1985 amid a media frenzy. He was later acquitted, but not before the Reagan administration got yet another black eye. And in classic Reagan style, the White House distanced itself faster than you can say organized crime. The irony? Donovan came from construction, a sector notorious for shady dealings, and was tasked with cleaning up labor. That's like putting a raccoon in charge of the garbage. Even after his acquittal, Donovan famously asked, "Which office do I go to get my reputation back?" Answer: definitely not the Reagan White House. They'd already moved on to the next ethics scandal. And there you have it. Ronald Reagan, the charming, joke-cracking cowboy who could sell optimism with a smile, even while the country was on fire behind him. Say what you will about the man, but there's no denying he knew how to perform the presidency like it was his final role in Hollywood. What do you think of Ronald Reagan? Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.